thank you so much for coming to our lesson today. As I was introduced, my name is Camille. You can call me teacher, you can call me Camille. I will respond to either of these. So I would request, if you feel comfortable, to put your camera on. That would be great. If you don't, that's okay. But as was said before, if you would like to participate, please put your hand up. I'm certainly going to be asking questions and wanting you to participate today. So I am the English teacher as well as the Canadian history teacher here with Canada Private School. And this is taken, our lesson today, from our Canadian history course. And I see I have at least one of my current Canadian history students here. So thank you so much, Isabella. Happy to have you here. So I hope you enjoy. Please ask questions and please participate. Our classes with Canada Private School are very active. We are talking all the time, and I would love to see that with our class here today. So to get started, the Government of Ontario outlines what we learn in this Canadian history course. So I wanted to share that with you. Throughout the whole entire Canadian history course, this course will explore social, economic, political developments and events and their impacts on the lives of different individuals, groups, and communities, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit individuals and communities in Canada since 1914. So while this is a Canadian history course, throughout the course, we do make connections to the whole world. We do want to be, of course, taking in your culture, your background, and making as many connections and sharing connections that we can. So again, while today's lesson is focused on Canada, I do invite you to share your background and your connections that you might have as well. So every class, we start with 2 of our learning goals that are taken from the Ontario Education Program, and we look at making them into our success criteria. So you will know that you have succeeded in today's lesson if by the end of the class, you can say, I can describe important government policies in Canada, and I can describe the effects of social inequality in Canada. Hi, Bianca, great to have you. Okay, so another piece of our historical thinking. When we think about history, oftentimes we think about lots and lots and lots of facts. However, history is much more than that. Depending how we view history and the lens through which we look at it, we're going to have different understandings. So with our Canadian history course, it's very important that we don't look at history as a solid fact, but we try to piece it together. So with our historical thinking equation, we think about the evidence, ethical dimension, historical perspectives, cause and consequence, community and change, as well as historical significance. And we'll look at a few of these today as we go through our lesson. So first, to get you guys active, I'm going to begin with a mind map. So I'm going to send you this link into the chat, and it looks like this. And what I want you to do, so I'll send it to everyone here in the chat. I want you to tell me, what do you think when you hear Canada? What comes to mind? I know for me, maybe it's snow, seeing as how it's March, but it snowed in my city yesterday. So snow would be a word, maybe maple syrup, maybe parades, as we have lots of parades. So anything that comes to mind when you hear the word Canada, please type in as many words as you can and hit submit. Let's see what we can come up with together. I'll give us a few minutes. So it'll take about 2 minutes here. If you can please type in as many words as you can in 2 minutes. You can think about food, activities, culture, maybe the landscape, what it looks like. If you know a few things about the history, that could be very helpful as well. But anything that comes to mind. Okay, and this is what we have so far. Yay! Snow, oh, waterfalls, I love it. There are beautiful waterfalls that we have here in Canada. The beaver, I love it, such a cute animal. Hockey, of course, yes. This is great. Let's see if we can get a few more here. And now these are all, in my perspective, pretty positive things about Canada. It's okay to put some things that might be negative. Maybe we can say that it's very open. The cities are busy, things are different. Maybe if you know the names of some cities, we could add that to our mind map. Okay, we'll stick with this. This is pretty good. A few additional words that I want to introduce you to. Now, I'm just going to take my pen and write them on the board. A very important word that I want to share with you when we think of Canada is also the word Indigenous. Very close to the word that we have in Spanish, of course. So Indigenous would be describing that group of people, the original first peoples of Canada. Now, they might not be the first group of people that come to mind when you think of Canada, but they are a very important part of Canadian culture. Our history course has a large focus on Indigenous people and the importance that they play within Canada, within the culture. So that's a word I would like for you to think about when you think of Canada, in addition to all of the wonderful words you have. So thank you guys so much for sharing that. I'm going to go back to the lesson now. Okay. So first, I want to introduce you to some key vocabulary that will be essential in understanding our content today. I have 4 different words. Some, again, look similar in Spanish. So I want you to think about them, and we'll start with the word feminist. Feminist is an interesting word. Sometimes it might have a negative feeling to it, perhaps. Maybe we don't think it's a good thing. Maybe we think it's a great thing. Words can have different feelings. Feminist is one of those words. Does anyone know or want to share what the word feminist might possibly mean? Any guesses? Okay, I'm going to pick on my friend Isabella because I know she's so smart. Isabella, what do you think feminist might mean?
To the women and men to have the same conditions?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Thank you so much for sharing. Women and men have the same conditions or rights, perhaps, too. Now, it's interesting. Often when we think of feminism or a feminist, we think about women being better than men and women having more rights than men. But truly, at the core, at the center of this word, the meaning is for women to be equal to men. So Isabella, thank you so much for sharing that. Well done. Our next word is counterculture. So another interesting word, I'm sure that we might be familiar with the word culture. And then counter being our prefix, we can think about how these 2 words go together in order to equal counterculture. Khalil, wonderful to have you here. Yay.
Hi, teacher. Good evening.
No, it's great that you came. Thank you so much. So counterculture, does anyone have a guess what this word might possibly mean? I'll help us with this one. Again, taking our prefix culture, we're thinking about cultural elements, those things that make up a group of people, and our prefix counter. So counterculture is going to be opposite of the normal culture. Or we could say opposite of the major group. So we're going against something here. So if we're counterculture, we're perhaps different than what the majority of the culture is doing. So we see this happen throughout history, where groups uprise and go very counter or opposite to what is popular at the time. Sometimes it's a great thing to have this counterculture. Our third word is suffrage. This one is strange. It's actually kind of difficult. I encourage you to think about what it might mean, And I know that Isabella knows this one because we just wrote an essay about it. Isabella, what do you remember about suffrage?
It's the right to vote in political decisions.
Thank you so much. The right to vote in political decisions. So when we think of suffrage, we think of groups of people gaining the right to vote. For example, in the past, women could not vote. Eventually, women gained suffrage. They gained that right to vote. We can think about the age. In certain countries, for example, the United States, you have to be 21 years old to vote. Does anyone know how old you have to be in Canada to vote? The federal voting age in Canada is 18. So suffrage, that right to vote, is granted to all Canadian citizens 18 years and older. So our last word that I want to introduce to you is civil liberties. Again, we can start to break this down. Liberties is plural. We can look at liberty as the singular and think about it in a civil sense. Does anyone have a guess what civil liberties might possibly mean? I'll help us with this one. Oh, thanks, Khalil. What do you think?
Maybe teacher is like liberties and some rights that you could have, but being a civil, so not, it's like the opposite idea of military or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Khalil, I love how you share the opposite. That's important. So civil liberties, we can think about the rights that you have as a citizen. You didn't have to really do anything to get these rights. You have them because you're a citizen. And these rights are protected by the law. So if someone goes against your rights, if someone steals your car, then you can go file a complaint, that person will get in trouble. That's your civil liberty to protect your property. So civil liberties are the rights we have as a citizen. These are the 4 key words that we're going to work with a little bit today. So hopefully you remember them. I know that we're going to see them again. So if you don't remember them, we'll look at them another time, no worries. So let's start talking about the importance and significance of cultural change. So social change. Our timeline today is going to start at the end of World War II. Now, unfortunately, I can't summarize World War II in a few minutes, but World War II is obviously the Second World War, and this happened in Europe. It happened in other parts of the world as well, I should say, in Japan, as well as the United States being involved. Canada fought in the Second World War. And if you think of the Second World War, you're trying to place what it might be. We can think about Nazi Germany kind of being the center of the Second World War. So our timeline and lesson today is going to begin at the end of that Second World War. So after the horrors of the Second World War, many countries shifted their focus to the prevention of violence and the protection of people. Now, of course, this makes sense because, again, the Second World War is centered around Nazi Germany, where many individuals, Jewish people, gypsies, gay people, lost their rights. So after the Second World War, so many countries looked in on what happened in Germany and thought about how they need to protect their people and prevent violence from happening to them. So that is where we're going to take our conversation today, how this prevention went in. So a Canadian law professor named John Humphrey became the director of the United Nations Division of Human Rights in 1946. If you've heard of the United Nations before, that's great. They have a blue logo, they wear blue helmets. Often they're known for peacekeeping and trying to establish peace in the world. So Canada has always been a very active member of the United Nations, as maybe your countries have as well. Social change, as I said, post-World War II. So before the Second World War, different marginalized groups in Canada pressed for things such as voting rights, for suffrage, and for the end of racial discrimination. Although progress was uneven, human rights awareness and activism gradually increased in Canada. So we see more and more people getting rights and being active in government, being active in politics. At the end of the Second World War, there was a greater push internationally to legislate human rights due to the global efforts of peace and cooperation. So this was happening not only in Canada, but the whole world saw that there was a need to establish basic human rights that every human on earth should have, no matter their circumstance, no matter the money they have, no matter their gender, everyone deserves those basic human rights. So what I want to do next is take us to a website that I use very often. So all of my students here, we're going over to Padlet, as I'm sure you might anticipate. I'm going to put this link into the chat. And sometimes Padlet will ask you to sign up, but you can keep it anonymous. That's totally fine. I have one question here that I would like for you to answer. My question for you is, what are some human rights? So you can add a comment right here. And I could simply say maybe freedom of speech. So you can add a comment telling me what you believe is a basic human right that all humans in the world have the right to. So take a second and think about it. And again, this is not specific to Canada. This is any country. And I'm just going to make sure that it will allow all the posts. Yeah. If the comment part is not working, if someone could let me know, that would be great, but I think it should be. So we'll take a few minutes, and it's okay if you're wrong. This is a part of learning. If you want to take a guess what a human right is and what some examples might be, that's perfect. Yes, right to equality, off to a great start. Another way that we can think about this, if you're struggling to find an answer, we can think about the rights that are protected by the government. So how does the government protect you? Big one, no discrimination. Absolutely. We can think about throughout history as well. I know that in many countries, there have been big protests, oftentimes at universities, and we can think about the rights that people are fighting for. What do they want to change? What do they believe should be their rights as a human of that country? You guys, these are excellent answers. We'll take one more minute and we'll talk about a few of them. Okay, thank you guys so much for these answers. Now, in my real history or English class, I would call upon each student to share their answer. I won't make anyone do that here, but just know that I do appreciate the answers. Thank you so much. So freedom from slavery, absolutely, that's a human right. Now, that one's very interesting. That has not always been a human right. If we think back in history, we know that slavery is a part of the world. But now that is a human right. That's great. Freedom of thought, absolutely. Freedom of religion and belief, yes, that is a very protected human right that we have here in Canada, and many countries do. Right to equality, yes, equality across gender, across race, across religion, that's perfect. No discrimination, excellent. And the right to live, that's really important as well. Now, building on from this, my question for you, the human rights that we have listed here as a class, does every country in the world have these same human rights? Does every country in the world have these same human rights? The answer is no. Unfortunately, there are countries in the world where these are not the standard, the normal human rights. For example, and I really appreciate this answer, the freedom of religion and belief. There are some countries in the world where you are not free to practice your religion, and you must follow the religion set by that country, set by that government. We can think of some countries, some Islamic countries in the Middle East, We can also think about perhaps even Canada in the past, where Indigenous people may have faced persecution had they followed their own beliefs. So that's such an important human right that we value today, that freedom of religion. Another one is free speech. Free speech is essential to who we are as Canadians. And now there's a difference between free speech and hate speech. If you are speaking your ideas, as we say here, the freedom of thought, that is free speech. If you are speaking about hating a group, discrimination, that is not free speech. So that is not a protected human right. So these are great. Does anyone have any questions or comments so far? Okay, thank you guys so much for adding to the Padlet. I appreciate it. So continuing on. Continuing with our free rights that we have as humans. So I want to introduce you to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. It looks like this. It's a big document. These are all of the rights that you have as a Canadian citizen. And I'm sure that your countries have something very similar, which is really interesting. Now, this is a document, but you can actually order one of these from the Canadian government and they will send it to your house, or you can download the PDF online, and it outlines all of the rights and freedoms that we have as Canadians. So taking a look at it, you already guessed a lot of those basic human rights on our Padlet. Those equality rights, that's so centered to who we are. The minority language rights. So in Canada, as you may know, there are two major languages of English and French being a minority language, meaning less people in Canada speak French, it is protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So that means when you visit Canada, all of the products you buy are going to have English as well as French written on them, because it is protected in this Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So if you go to buy a box of cereal for breakfast, it will have the English name as well as the French name. All products are like that, protected under this Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have the freedom to have mobility meaning being able to move. We have legal rights, meaning that we have rights to participate in government, and so on. So I encourage you to think about the country you live in right now and what your document looks like that outline all the rights and freedoms you have as a citizen. And it's important to note that as a Canadian, you do not have to earn these rights. They are inherent. You have them because you live in the country, because you are that citizen. You are protected by the government with these rights. So if something were to go against your rights, you are very free to fight it and make sure that right is done, that you are in the right. So the video we are going to watch today shows the signing of that Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and there's an important lady in it that we will talk about after. So I'm going to just show the first minute of this video here on YouTube. It is a full 9 minutes. We are not going to watch the full 9 minutes. We'll watch just the first one together. So I'm going to share my computer sound, and I'm going to turn off my video, and I'll turn it on after. So I hope you enjoy this video. This is taken from the 1980s, and as you can see, very popular event, lots and lots of people.
April 17th, 1982 was a big day in Canadian history. It was the day Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau met with Queen Elizabeth II in Ottawa to sign the proclamation to amend the Canadian Constitution, which is the document that created Canada as a country. An amendment means to make a change, and this change was a very, very important one. For many years, groups of people fought hard to be treated equally under the law, and finally the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms could come into effect, and more than 100 years of hard-fought rights and freedoms fell under the protection of Canada's supreme law. On this date, a majority of Canada's elected representatives felt it was important to include a list of our rights and freedoms that could not be easily infringed or denied. The Charter describes important rights and freedoms that belong to all Canadians. These rights cannot be taken away by anyone, not even federal or provincial governments. The rights and freedoms described in the Charter are those that must exist in a free and democratic society. Before we can talk all about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we need to understand some key words.
Okay, thank you for watching that video with me. So the important person we saw was the Queen of England. Does anyone know why the Queen of England would be at the signing of this Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada? Tell me, Cleo, what do you think?
Well, teacher, I have to admit that I think it was 1 month ago that I wanted to know more about it. And I know that Canada, I don't remember if it's New Zealand, Australia, and United Kingdom are part of the Commonwealth. So I like it. I like to investigate about it. Yes, it's very interesting.
That's amazing that you looked that up. So Cleo just shared with us a really key word. Thank you for that, Cleo. The Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth would be the countries that were previously colonies of the United Kingdom, meaning we were colonized by Great Britain. So as Cleo said, we have Canada, New Zealand, Australia, a bunch of the little islands, the Canary Islands. India is a part of the Commonwealth, among other countries. So that's why it was important for the Queen of England to be a part of signing this document, because while she is what we call a figurehead in Canada, she is still an important symbol of that freedom that we enjoy as Canadians. So continuing on, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or simply as we call it in Canada, the Charter, is the most visible and recognized part of Canada's Constitution. The Constitution is the document that created Canada. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was published, brought to life in 1982. After they saw some missing pieces. Under the original Constitution, not everyone was equal. So in the 1980s, as we saw in the video, those government officials believed it to be important to rewrite it and include those rights and freedoms that cover all Canadians. The Charter guarantees the rights of individuals and certain limits on them in the highest law of the land. Since its enactment, so again, when it came to life in 1982, the Charter has created a social and legal revolution, a big change in Canada. As we see again, more people have gained rights that are now protected. So taking another look at our document, the building at the bottom is the Canadian Parliament building in Ottawa, the one that you would have seen in that video where all the people were standing outside of. So if we look at the previous one, we're kind of answering our question here about the rights and freedoms that we have as Canadians. For the sake of time, I'm going to go up a little bit further because I want to share a textbook with you. So not every class of Canada Private School will have a textbook. However, in history, we have what I believe is a really great textbook that I want to share. So this is what it looks like. I know it's quite small on the way I have my screen right now. You can certainly zoom it up a little bit more, but this is what it looks like. And I'm taking page 210 to give you an example of some of the rights that we might read about in the textbook. So skimming through our next page, we see two important rights that people in Canada have. The first one is going to be women's rights. So this is important to what we said previously about being a feminist or following the practice of feminism. It was recognized in 1982 that women had a more challenging time, perhaps, obtaining equality to men, whether it be they had a more difficult time getting the same jobs, the same education, or moving into positions of government, of politics. So this law, this charter, tried to change that. Now, realistically today, are men equal to women? In many ways, are women equal to men? In many ways, probably not, but there certainly is a good advance, a good movement that way. So women's rights activists protested against Canadian laws that supported those traditional roles for women. The reforms in divorce and abortion legislation were welcomed by many people. These were important steps towards women's equality. Many unions joined the fight for women's rights. For example, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, the people who send the mail, were the first to win the right for paid maternity leave for its members. This is revolutionary. In the United States, there's currently no law, regulation, policy that guarantees maternity leave for individuals. In Canada, that is now protected under our women's rights. So if you have a baby, you have the right to have some time off from work, which feels pretty fair. Our second important right that we see introduced into Canada, and this is coming from not the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but specifically from a bill, so another piece of policy called Bill C-150. And this was a bill that once passed allowed gay men and lesbians to live their lives. Prior to this bill, although not commonly done, but it was potential that gay men, lesbians, anyone a part of that LGBTQ+ community could be arrested and sent to prison, denied employment, or just otherwise persecuted. So in the 1960s, we see with groups of hippies, if anyone's familiar with the term hippie, I know it's often a Halloween costume now with the flowing dresses and the big hair and the glasses and the flowers. But in the 1960s, gay rights activists began to organize and draw attention to these injustices. This took tremendous courage, huge courage, as the attitudes of many Canadians, churches, and members of government at all levels were not really in line with that. They were strongly anti-gay, as we would say. So gay people began to publicly show pride, and we see less persecution. So we do see that big changes were made. And again, we see big changes being made because there are people that are protesting. So even if we don't always agree with what people are protesting, that's how changes are made. And we see that specifically with these two rights that are now a part of Canadian law, a part of policy in Canada, where we have women's equality rights as well as gay rights that are going to be protected from that document we saw earlier, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So our class is almost over. It's been a lot of me talking, and normally I want to share with you, it would not be me talking so much, as I'm sure Isabella, Bianca, and Khalil can all attest to. It's normally a lot of students talking. So my questions I want to end on today, to have you think and reflect about what we've learned. My first question is, what are human rights? How do we define human rights, or what are some examples? Bianca, it's so lovely to see you and have you here. Can you answer this one for us? What are some human rights, maybe?
Yes. Well, we have human rights simply because we exist as human beings, and they are like moral principles for certain standards of human behavior, and that regularly protect in international law and also to the people.
Wow, great way defining that. Thank you so much. I love how you bring it to an international level. If we go back to one of the groups we talked about earlier in our lesson today, and we think about the United Nations works to establish basic human rights that are international. So that's a great word to bring in here. Now, there are many international human rights that the United Nations works to enforce. It's not always successful, but they do recognize those human rights. So that's really important. Thanks, Tom and Bianca. My second question, how are human rights protected in Canada? So how are your rights protected in Canada? Does anyone have an idea? Maybe a bill, a policy, a document that protects? Thanks, Bianca. What do you think?
School bill, like by the Constitution.
Exactly, that works. The Constitution. We could also say the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And then there will be some specific bills, such as we saw with our gay rights under Bill C-150, that will protect those rights. So there are multiple ways that human rights are protected in Canada, but mainly, as Bianca said, through the Constitution, as well as that Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we looked at together. So what bill, legislation, or policy enforces this protection of Canada? That's the one that we just talked about as well. So again, that Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we looked at, perhaps Bill C-150, or in a general sense, the Constitution. So the way that we maintain our human rights, if we see that things are going wrong and we are losing our human rights, is largely through protesting. So in our history course, we examine many protests that happen in Canada that often do have many international connects, because protest is a very international phenomenon, a very international thing. And we know that protests are going to make change, and therefore we see that connect to our human rights and how we obtain those human rights. So with that being said, muchas gracias a todos. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you're coming away learning a few things about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, some human rights that you have as an individual, and some rights that you can enjoy in Canada as well. So thank you guys so much for your time. I appreciate it. I'm not sure if Jessica wants to take over, but I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks, you guys. Awesome.